what does it mean when we have a fear of something happening and, like, for example, a fear of abandonment, a fear of rejection, and it's kind of like haunted us throughout our life? Where could that be coming from? Well, that's one of the reasons why I was really interested in this paper that I found by Winnicott called Fear of Breakdown. And I found this other great paper by Thomas Ogden called Fear of Breakdown and the Unlived Life. The one by Winnicott was published after his death, so it was incomplete. His wife published it in 1974, and I think that's an interesting synchronicity because this paper, Fear of Breakdown, in part deals with like this idea of loss of self and annihilation, and just kind of like the experiences that can be so painful that they overwhelm us on a very deep level, and they overwhelm our ability to defend ourselves. And when I say defend ourselves, I mean that like we all have defenses, which are strategies that we use often without being aware of them to help protect our sense of self. And I like to do this for the ego. And when I say ego, I don't mean in a bad way, like, oh, she's so egotistical. I mean ego in a good way. Like if this is my identity, um, like it can be very healthy to have those defenses because they protect my sense of identity and help me recognize what's inside of me, what's outside of me. What is like my relationship to other people, also what is my relationship to my body. All of these things can kind of be impacted by this ability to have a stable, um, almost like bubble, you can think of it, right? Like if an eggshell is another good metaphor, so we'll stick with that one for the time being as I shuffle metaphors. But if you think of an eggshell, um, you would want to protect it from getting cracked, right? And if it gets too cracked, everything that's inside comes outside and gets mixed up with the environment. So that's kind of what we're talking about today a little bit, and what I learned from these. This is my interpretation. The beautiful thing about depth work is that there's so many different ways to take it. So please take it as that. This is my interpretation and my thoughts regarding these two papers. And on that note, too, if this material might be triggering for you, since we're talking about failures that often happened really early in childhood, like abandonment from a caregiver or perceived abandonment, meaning like for whatever reason, there was a breakdown in the relationship or in the caregiver's ability to soothe the infant, which might have had nothing to do with the caregiver. It might have been that the infant's pain or um, what they were experiencing was just not able to be soothed, that no one could have soothed it, right? But that could be perceived by the infant as like a failure on the caregiver's part and like they were being abandoned or neglected or harmed. Like that, these breakdowns, I mean, they are triggering sometimes to talk about. So please care for yourself. If this is not a good topic for you, skip it. Or if you need like some self-care stuff, I always recommend like whatever you enjoy, whatever helps you feel present. Um, I always like stuff that has a scent of some kind and like maybe a texture or, some like spicy tea or, we can get creative with what self-care or grounding things help. So on that note, I'm going to jump in. So when Winnicott writes about the fear of breakdown, he proposes that a lot of what we fear, this fear of breakdown or of falling apart, is actually due, in fact, to something that happened previously, but that we are not aware of. Um, and there are reasons for this. And what he means by the failure um, of a break, like the failure of a defense organization, he writes, but immediately we ask a defense against what? And this leads us to a deeper meaning of the term, since we need to use the word breakdown to describe the unthinkable state of affairs that underlies the defense organization. So I think what he is trying to say here is that we have this breakdown of he says here, the breakdown of the establishment of the unit self that is indicated. The ego organizes defenses against breakdown of ego organization. And it is the ego organization that is threatened. that the ego cannot organize against environmental failure insofar as dependence is a living fact. So I really love this piece here because dependence is a living fact. If you look at humans in real relationships, dependence is a state that we will inevitably be in at one point in time and that we have been in the past. Let me give you an example, right? Like an infant is truly dependent on their caregivers. They do not have the ability to, feed themselves or, secure their own safety. It's a very vulnerable state, right? And people who have, throughout our lifespan, we're going to have times of dependence, right? And so I think that sometimes when we talk about like attachment in relationships now, it seems like there's so much emphasis on like, people having insecure attachment and needing to like fix that we sometimes gloss over the very like painful reality that is beneath what I see as like survival behaviors, right? Um, so I just wanted to say that because when we are in this state of vulnerability and dependence due to our natural development as human beings, um, the things that can happen can be very overwhelming to this sense of self. So, what's cool about Winnicott is that Winnicott worked with children and was a physician. So Winnicott understood, in my opinion, what parents and children go through. So Winnicott writes here a little bit about absolute dependence. And Winnicott also describes the facilitating environment. And by facilitating environment, they really mean like the development environment that a infant and child are in. So this could be like the caregivers or other people that are participating in that person's life. And they write here, he writes here, the facilitating environment can be described as holding, developing into handling, to which is added object presenting. Okay. In such a facilitating environment, the individual undergoes development, which can be classified as integrating, to which is added indwelling or psychosomatic collusion, and then object relating. Now, I'm going to give my like uh, just basic interpretation of that. So, what we mean is like if you have a very early stage of an infant, we're talking about holding, and holding meaning that the caregiver is helping the infant by taking on a lot of the infant's distress and literally just has to hold it. So, like if a baby is crying, screaming, they're in pain, they're fussy, they're gassy, whatever it is, they're hungry, the caregiver really needs to take on a lot of that. The infant does not have the capacity to. And then handling, as like a child grows, you're able to, help them more with like integrating, saying things like, "Oh, I see you're angry because I did this," or you're sad because this happened. Oh, you fell down and your knee hurts. So helping them make sense of the world. And also indwelling or psychosomatic collusion. This is being located in your body and having a relationship to your body, because the idea is that infants have a really hard time understanding what is my body and what is caregiver's body. What does it mean to be separate? Because in the womb, they weren't really separate, right? They were connected. Fetuses are connected to the mother. Um, and so that's kind of the way that it's been conceptualized, anyways. And then we have object relating and object presenting. So this just means that, like, as we become, older and older, we tend to have the ability to like recognize our permanence and recognize our relationship to other people in the environment. Because like a 4-year-old, for example, will stand between you and a television and they think that because they can see the TV, you can see the TV. They don't understand that you guys are going to see different things because you have different eyes and different locations, etc. So, this stuff develops over time. And as children get older, they develop the ability for more abstract thought, which helps them navigate like their relationship to other things in this world. And that abstract thought ability happens later, like age 9, um, And, it depends. Each person's a little different, but sometimes I think we forget that development happens like at different rates, and some of this stuff that we take for granted as adults is just not yet present in young children. Okay, and so here's the piece about dependence that I really liked. Okay, so this is what Winnicott says. At the time of absolute dependence, with the mother supplying an auxiliary ego function, it has to be remembered that the infant has not yet separated out the not me from the me. This cannot happen apart from the establishment of me. So to me, this ego function, right? It's like the mom. Of course, it's always like a mom in these older articles. So we'll just swap that out. We'll say the caregiver is serving the defense organization, like soothing the baby, feeding the baby, giving the baby words to explain their experience, mirroring the facial expression so that the baby doesn't feel alone and feels like seen and heard. Um, hopefully following the baby's cues about like distance and needs, like when they need space so that it's not like overwhelming too much. It's very hard, right? There's a lot of skills that are assumed on the part of the caregiver here. Um, and of course, there's a lot of failures that naturally happen. Even from like the most, equipped caregiver possible, there's a lot of learning that happens, especially with like a first child. And, just because we're adults doesn't mean that we're perfect. We all have stuff that we're working through. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the primitive agonies here, just to validate like the pain that some of us experienced when we were young. Um, so this is, Winnicott notes that it says, from this chart, it is possible to make a list of primitive agonies. Anxiety is not strong enough word here. Here are a few. 1, a return to an unintegrated state. The defense for this is disintegration. So unintegrated state meaning your inner life is just very chaotic and almost like a soup, right? Everything's mixed up and all mixed together. And the idea here is that in order to try to, later in life, in order to try to like unconsciously defend against that return to that state of being like all mixed up and not having that sense of self that's like well organized, is that we would disintegrate, like fall, like those internal boundaries and separations would kind of fall apart. Um, the second, oh, and a piece for this too, internal disintegration, I think of this as well as like um, being able to recognize like the different aspects of like our um, functioning and like navigating our emotions, our thoughts, our body experiences, and making sense of them. Being human is actually, I feel like a lot of work, um, right? Because you have to be like, okay, I'm having a headache, or I need to go eat something. I also have a meeting coming up. Oh, I have to pay bills. On an emotional level, I'm really angry at the car that just cut me off, and I want to flip them off, but I'm not going to. I'm going to like restrain myself. So there's all these different like processes that are going on within us. Okay, so this is the second one. Falling forever. The defense for this is self-holding. I think that's pretty interesting because babies when they have like the startle reflex, that can get triggered when you're like setting them down. It's like they think, I always think it's like they think they're falling, kind of like when we have nightmares and you think you're hitting the ground and you wake up flinching. That's what that makes me think of. 3, loss of psychosomatic collusion, failure of indwelling. Defense, depersonalization. So this is the psychosomatic collusion, indwelling. To me, that's being in your body. This is probably oversimplifying things, but I think simple has its place. So depersonalization, this is when you feel like you're not in your body, like you're not who you are necessarily. This is a type of dissociation phenomenon. 4, loss of sense of real. Defense, exploitation of primary narcissism, etc. That's kind of glossed over. That would take a lot of time to explain. But narcissism and the sense of real, just a really basic thing here is I think a lot of times when we hear the word narcissism, we hear it in the sense of like narcissistic personality disorder, but really we actually all have to have narcissism needs fulfilled when we're growing up, or we have problems with, with our sense of self and our ability to validate ourselves and others. So for me, part of this, developmentally speaking, is being able to like get the mirroring we need. So like to see ourselves right-sized through our caregiver's eyes. So an example of this would be like if a little kid, um, like falls down and scrapes their knee, the ideal like holding might be for the parent to say like, "Oh, I see you fell down and scraped your knee. Like, how do you feel? Like, how much does it hurt? Are you hurt? Are you scared?" Maybe helping give them those words if they don't know the language yet, and then like helping them soothe that pain. What you wouldn't want is like an inflammation of the situation where like the mom is like screaming, or crying, or I say mom, the caregiver, sorry, where the caregiver is having this big reaction. And it's just out of like, if the kid is here and the caregiver is here, that can be a little disorienting, right? Or if the caregiver is down here minimizing it, just stand up, brush it off, you're fine. Um, Both of those are not meeting the kid where they're at. And this is really hard. I feel like it's all a calibration process as a caregiver. Like, when we accidentally overreact, especially if we have our own trauma histories, like there will be times, most likely, when our reaction is maybe up here, but we want it to be down here. The beauty of like parenting and development is there's that rupture and repair process where like we acknowledge when there's a miss or like a misconnection or a missed need, and we can talk about it and try to heal it. Okay, so the fifth agony that Winnicott lists here is loss of capacity to relate to objects. Defense, autistic states relating only to self phenomena. Um, so this is literally like withdrawing from the world. And I just want to highlight that in older depth literature, they talk about autistic states as being basically like a um, like someone's withdrawn from the world, withdrawn from others, and they're in a bubble. So today we would not use that language. I'm just quoting Winnicott here. I would just say, instead, today I would probably say just that, like retreating from the world, retreating from others, being in your own kind of bubble. Just because we haven't maintained the ability to relate, um, which does require a lot relating to people. So I just wanted to, I know this is a longer video, so thank you for bearing with me if you have. I'm just going to say here. So Winnicott says basically that the illnesses that we can have can be seen, I'm paraphrasing here, right? As defense organization relative to these different primary agonies that I explained. And that because these experiences are so painful, we have not been able to like work them through consciously. And so he says that in therapy, one of the ways that we can create healing here is that when this primitive agony, like this failure, developmentally, and I like to be careful that this is not like the caregiver's failure. Like sometimes a caregiver is not able to meet a kid's needs, and it's not even about the caregiver. It's just like the suffering is quite intense, and we're only human. We have limited tools. So I wanted to say that the idea is that if in therapy a similar phenomenon occurs, for example, let's say that the therapist is not able to hold the client's emotions, right? Like the client has some pretty painful emotion, and the client is experiencing the therapist as not being like empathetic, as not providing like a container, or like a sense of safety and support. That failure, if they're able to work it through in their relationship by talking about it, and by reflecting on it and then repairing it, can be helpful for this continued fear and like wound in that area. So it's kind of cool because one of the ways that depth, like theory works is that it a lot of times issues that someone is bringing into therapy are seen as being like able to be resolved through the therapeutic relationship. so there's that healing that can happen when we're able to bring it into awareness, talk about it, grieve it, um, and then make sense of it so that we have that like sense of self, and also like use tools to kind of work through the suffering and pain that's involved, because some of this stuff is quite painful, right? Um, and I like that Winnicott says basically like that a lot of times, in order for these agonies, like the primitive agonies, to get into the past where they belong, the the ego has to first bring it into its present time experience and into control now, with the support of the analyst serving as like a caregiver role, where the analyst is helping hold, helping regulate, helping work through. So yeah, that is some of what I thought was really powerful about this. Um, and I like that, Winnicott and Ogden, they both acknowledge the challenges in therapy, or they, call it analysis, of working on this material and on getting to these breakthroughs. Um, it's not easy, it's not linear, but by really addressing the dynamic, there's so much healing that can happen. And I wanted to say there were two other things I highlighted here. Okay. One is that, okay. Okay. In some patients, emptiness needs to be experienced, and this emptiness belongs to the past, to the time before the degree of maturity has made it possible for emptiness to be experienced. To understand this, it is necessary to think not of trauma, but of nothing happening when something might profitably have happened. It is easier for a patient to remember trauma than to remember nothing happening when it might have happened. At the time, the patient did not know what might have happened, and so could not experience anything except to note that something might have been. Um, I think that's a really powerful statement because it's like the absence. And I think I could just spend a lot of time reflecting on that alone. I won't here. But basically, sometimes what we need to work through is an absence of something that should have occurred. And so a lot of people with this thing might not necessarily see it as a trauma because it's like maybe something that needed to happen just didn't happen. Maybe it's more along the lines of like neglect, or just like being like the caregiver kind of like missing um, the person. And I think of this in therapy as when like there's an attempt at a connection and the connection is just kind of like missed, or like the client needs something and for whatever reason it's not provided. Um, that's just how I see it. But a lot of interesting things there. So in interest of time, I'm not going to go in deep work through what Ogden wrote, but I am going to share just a few little things. So one thing is I like that Ogden referred to Winnicott's paper as a difficult essay, often confusing and opaque, but did identify that this is like a new line of thought that Winnicott came up with. And that Ogden says, my own interpretation of fear of breakdown begins with the idea that the breakdown on which Winnicott is focusing is a breakdown in the mother-infant bond. Unable to bear on his own the primitive agonies that result from the break in the bond with the mother, the infant short circuits the event in such a way that he does not experience it and substitutes for it defenses of a psychotic nature. By not experiencing the breakdown when it occurred in infancy, the individual creates a psychological state in which he lives in fear of a breakdown that has already happened, but which he did not experience. I suggest that the driving force of the individual's need to find the source of his fear is his feeling that a part of his life has been taken from him, and what has been left for him is a life that is, in important ways, an unlived life. Um, so very powerful work. I'm going to include the citations for both of these in the like description of the video. Also, I wanted to end by saying that um, to me, I think that when we're working with this early development stuff, it's so good to just practice good self-care and to practice grounding, and also to just see like how can I meet these needs for myself today? How can I get these needs met in relationships with others today? Um, also to give ourselves, I think, like a lot of empathy and compassion because those primitive agonies are pretty intense. And, a lot of people experienced failures in the holding environment just by nature of life, right? Like if someone was born premature and was in the hospital or needed, medical procedures that were painful, it could have been perceived as a failure from the caregiver. Or if a caregiver themselves had, mental illness or trauma or never experienced holding from their own caregiver before them, there could be an intergenerational trauma trickle down that might have made them unable to meet their infant's needs in the way that the infant needed them to be met because sometimes it's hard because we don't have the same needs as our children or as our caregivers. I think it's pretty common for people to be different and need different things. And so there's lots of benefit, I think, to having a compassionate, like, seek to understand rather than to be understood mindset when we work with this stuff. Thank you for listening. If this was helpful, please like, share, or subscribe. Also, feel free to, leave your own thoughts about it in the comments. And yeah, thank you. I appreciate your time.